Hi, my name is Ofa YouTube Videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things. I've been wanting to talk about Promising Young Woman ever since I first started my Was This Movie Actually Feminist or Was I Just Told It Was series, but I knew enough about the movie, and particularly how the movie ends, to put off actually watching it for a very long time. However, Emerald Fennell has recently made a new movie, and what this means other than a run on videos about Wuthering Heights that I've been waiting to watch until after my friend Marty finishes theirs, is that there's been a lot of discourse about her as a filmmaker in recent weeks. Though, I guess not enough discourse for me to learn how to correctly pronounce her name until the second half of this video. Sorry, Emerald Fennell. Like, I'm not that sorry, but I am a little bit sorry. In my defense, I'm familiar with the word fennel, as in the plant. I didn't think the second L made that much of a difference. My bad. You can go watch any of those other videos for a better grasp on the Wuthering Heights discourse, but the aspect of it that I have found most maddening is being told, primarily by other white women, that criticism of Emerald Fennell is in itself inherently anti-feminist. And you should probably already know that that argument doesn't really work on me. I enjoy taking aim at the directors I feel get shrouded with this sort of thought-terminating defense in this series. I've already made videos about Greta Gerwig's Barbie and Lady Bird and Olivia Wilde's Booksmart. If you've seen those, you know that neither being made by a woman or being enjoyed by women are enough to protect a movie with messy messaging from my criticism. The thing about the movie I'm going to be talking about today is that it is so bad. So remarkably, impressively bad that I retroactively feel a little bit guilty for sorting Greta Gerwig so closely with Emerald Fennell. Olivia Wilde. Olivia Wilde, who marketed a movie where all of the sex is inherently non-consensual with self-congratulatory lines to the press about how brave she was for showing female pleasure on screen, Olivia can stay where I sorted her right next to Emerald Fennell. But Promising Young Woman is such a bad film that it makes me want to be kinder to Barbie, which still has incoherent gender politics, but is not nearly as confused and infuriating as Emerald Fennell's first film. In case you are lucky and have not seen Promising Young Woman yet, I do want to give a trigger warning up front. This video is a video about a movie about sexual violence and the many, many ways that Emerald Fennell mishandled it. That's what I'm going to be discussing throughout. So if this doesn't feel like a safe video to watch with that knowledge, please go watch something else. This video will still be here if or when you might feel more like engaging with the subject matter. Promising Young Woman is, by a pretty wide margin, even including the weird and vaguely homophobic undertones in Wuthering Heights, almost certainly the worst film that I will ever cover in this pseudo-feminist film series. I am struggling to put into words how much I loathe this movie, which I knew would happen when I watched it, which is why I hadn't even seen the film until just prior to scripting this video. I do remember seeing trailers before its release and being excited for the movie, which I assumed was about Carey Mulligan's character killing men who attempted to sexually assault her upon seeing her drunk at a club. This is not what the movie is about, because Emerald Fennell is a coward. The movie is instead about a woman named Cassie, who, yes, as seen in the trailer, pretends to be drunk at a club and goes home with nefarious men who would attempt to borrow words I've seen Emerald Fennell use in interviews, take advantage of her.
Fennell, who is a producer and writer on the 2019 series of Killing Eve and plays Camilla Parker Bowles, now the Duchess of Cornwall in The Crown, drew on her experiences seeing drunk girls being taken advantage of when coming up with the concept. It's a huge part of hookup culture, regrettably, she tells BBC News, and there still isn't that much opprobrium on people who sleep with very drunk girls. It was absolutely commonplace when I was growing up. I think probably in most places it still is.
If you don't like the euphemism, you're not alone. I hate it too. But this movie pulls every punch that it possibly can until the end, when it aims the punch in the wrong direction entirely. Cassie, played by Carey Mulligan, pretends to be drunk, goes home with these men, alone and very vulnerable, though the movie clearly doesn't actually think she is vulnerable. She waits until they make some sort of advance as if to assault her, and then suddenly shuts off her drunk girl act. It's not murder, it's not really any kind of revenge fantasy, it is a stern talking to. She lectures them for attempting to assault a drunk woman. Oh wait, my bad, the movie does not use the word assault, even once. She lectures them for attempting to have sex with a drunk woman. And none of these men become violent when their advances are rejected. One of them says repeatedly in classic Fennell heavy-handed dialogue that he is a nice guy. And he is, I guess, because Cassie is somehow, against all odds, entirely safe and entirely in control during these confrontations, leaving each of them in one piece, unassaulted, unmurdered, and apparently not even a little bit concerned about either of those things happening to her. There is a misdirect at one point early on in the film to imply that better movie that I made up in my head upon seeing the trailer. We see her with ketchup on her shirt that we're meant to at first assume is Adam Brody's blood, but it turns out that he, like every guy in this movie, but we'll get to it, also left their interaction in one piece. Let's just talk about this for a moment before we go any further, since clearly nobody attempted to talk through this with Fennell. Cassie's game plan here, which we're shown that she's done dozens of times, always at the same bar, which is frequented by all the same men who do not have any kind of whisper network about how she's done this dozens of times, is to pretend to be very drunk, to essentially bait these men into taking her home and assaulting her. And then, the moment when the power is reclaimed, when it becomes obvious that Cassie will not be assaulted, is the moment when she reveals that she isn't truly drunk. What do we think that's implying? Consider it for just a second, because that'll mean you're thinking about it longer than Emerald Fennell did. Being drunk leaves her vulnerable to assault, and being sober precludes her from experiencing it. Do you get it? Do you get what the messaging of this film is? It's that drunk women get assaulted, and that it is their fault that that happened, on account of clearly the men would have stopped if the women were not, in fact, drunk. Are you fucking kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? This is the primary conceit of the film, a film that, like the rest of Fennell's work, has somehow garnered itself not just feminist credit, but so much feminist credit that critics of this and of Wuthering Heights are shut down and told that their complaints about the very repeatedly flawed ways in which this woman handles storytelling are inherently misogynistic. They're saying that about a woman who made a movie where the primary conceit is that if you don't get drunk, you won't be assaulted. But I'm the anti-feminist here, because I think movies should be good even when they're made by women. Sure. Okay. Cassie's motivation for doing this is because she had a friend in college who was assaulted. Fennell did not see fit to give the main role in this movie to somebody who actually survived sexual assault. And things that she has said in interviews about how she couldn't imagine a way that the lead could have survived the film without it being terribly depressing underscore exactly how unworthy of narrative focus Emerald Fennell sees the actual survivors of traumatic assault as being. You know, like you couldn't just get that from the absolutely ass movie she made about it. The movie is so ass. I cannot express to you how ass this movie is. That best friend was named Nina, and all we really get to learn about Nina is that she was very cool and confident until she was assaulted, at which point she was destroyed as a person, no longer herself, hollowed out and replaced by her assaulter. Nina seems to have at least attempted to seek some kind of justice after her assault. Minor characters in the film include the dean of a college who didn't take the story seriously for fear of destroying a man's life, and a retired former defense lawyer who is already a sad, crumbled husk of a man sitting around in his home waiting for someone to come and give him the retribution he so craves for his career, getting sexual abusers off the hook by blaming their victims. Cassie immediately forgives the lawyer, tells him that she forgives him out loud. By contrast, she tricks the dean into believing that her daughter is currently being assaulted. This is another overarching theme throughout the movie, this uneven distribution of vengeance. Cassie doing much crueler things to the women she feels were involved in covering up her friend's assault than she does to the would-be assaulters at the bar who just get a stern little lecture.
While the would-be sex criminals get away with a YouTube prank-style scare, Connie Britton's character is made to believe that her daughter is being violently assaulted while she can do nothing to intervene. All while the person telling her this sits there smugly, and then once the truth is revealed, takes the time to call her teenage daughter not very bright. And in the case of Alison Brie's character, she's plied with alcohol by Cassie and then handed off to a stranger at the hotel bar, so that when she wakes up, she'll believe she was assaulted the day before. Maybe I'm just being sensitive here, but don't these punishments seem excessive for the women whose crime at the most was negligence or cruelty, when the crimes the men have or were going to commit are far worse?
I'm sure in advance somebody's going to tell me that this is just Cassie being nuanced and complex or something, but those people are wrong. Cassie is not like this because she's a real and complicated and messy person. She's like this because the woman who wrote her character seems to kind of hate women and used that character to punish women with. women, the people who like Emerald Fennell's movies, which is why I'm told I can't criticize her films, totally makes sense. We get a whole lot of nothing about Nina. She is barely even cast, appearing only in pictures and in mentions. She's meant to be Cassie's driving motivation, but the way that she's depicted is hollow at best, and a prime example of the trope of the perfect victim at worst. Nina's dead before the movie starts. She seems to have died by suicide, though that's not explicitly confirmed in the film, and I couldn't even begin to guess how long after the assault this happened because the movie doesn't really care about her that much. I mean, I guess it was far enough after the fact for her to have at least attempted to bring it to court, it would appear, but other than that, Nina's a big ol' question mark. Again, this story would be much cleaner if Cassie were the one with the traumatic backstory, but that would require this film to have much more empathy for survivors than it actually does, so that was clearly off the table. To be a good survivor, a perfect victim, to stand any chance at being sympathized with, you have to be dead. The movie is actually weirdly and frighteningly pro-suicide, which we'll get to as we discuss the end of the film, and that's just one of many things that comes to mind in terms of how fucking irresponsible this movie Emerald Fennell made was. In interviews, Fennell has said something that I find extremely telling. The movie was inspired not actually by her own experiences, not even by speaking to people who had these experiences, but by, as she puts it, her own experiences seeing drunk girls being taken advantage of. Which, two things here. One, she's describing being a bystander, though she doesn't give enough of a shit about this topic to describe it that way. And two, she's describing assault, actually. I guess I shouldn't be shocked that she wasn't throwing the word rape around in interviews because it, somehow, is not used once. One single time. It is not used at all in the nearly 2-hour-long film. This is a movie about sexual violence and rape culture that refuses to use the word rape or any word like it. I kept my ear out for assault or attack as well, and I heard neither. The closest she gets is had sex with her multiple times while she was too drunk to consent, which, that is just so many levels of detachment and euphemization. I actually double-checked the script, and it is, if you can believe it, worse than that. The word consent is not used in this scene. In fact, it's not used in the script at all. Cassie's actual phrasing when speaking to Dean Walker is, had sex with her repeatedly and in front of his friends while she was too drunk to have any idea what was going on. Why would you pull that? Why? Why would you pull that punch? Literally, why? For what reason? In a 2020 Sundance Q&A that my friend Little Shop of Alley sent me, Fennell is asked about this refusal to use the actual term. Bafflingly, she answers the question as though she was being asked why the rapist in the film didn't use the word, and not why Cassie herself also has this aversion to using any words to do with sexual violence. But I thought this part was so telling.
It's the reluctance to even be in the same room as the R word, I think. Yeah.
I'm trying not to keep pausing and pointing out how bewildering this woman's unearned feminist credit is, but doesn't that just stick in your craw? How could you possibly make a movie actually examining this topic when you kill your only victim and refuse to say the word at all? You can't. At least you can't make an effective movie about it, not when you're so completely refusing to engage with your own subject matter. Even just this initial conceit of her having men bring her home from the bar so she can give them a stern talking to is so absurdly disconnected from actual statistics about how sexual violence goes down. According to Rain, a source that I trust a lot more to know what they're talking about sexual violence than I do Emerald Fennell, 60% of all reported instances of rape are committed by somebody known to the victim. All the instances of attempted sexual violence in this film, when Cassie has these men bringing her home from the bar, are extrapolated from what, in real life, only makes up around 30% of these reported assaults. And I say reported as in there are more that we don't hear about, not as in I don't believe them. As I'll get into later in the video, I think some of this ignorance would have been more excusable with just a few slight tweaks to the plot of the movie, but this film got exactly one draft of its screenplay and seemingly less than one iota of meaningful research for anything other than the extremely violent scene at the end. So what was I expecting, really?
It's the reluctance to even be in the same room as the R word, I think. Yeah.
We'll get into this more later, but it doesn't make sense to focus on these stranger danger cases when Emerald Fennell has access to the same goddamn internet I do. She could have done 1 day of research. She could have talked to an expert for 10 minutes, and I don't feel convinced that she did. So, allow me to go through a 5-point Roman numeral list of baffling decisions, pulled punches, and other failures to live up to the premise of this movie. You don't need my permission to still like this movie. I can't do anything about that. I'm not trying to take anything away from you here by criticizing it. But I do think it's worth the question if somebody actually deserves credit for starting an important conversation if they refused to actually meaningfully engage with that conversation in their work. Okay, I was wrong. It's tally marks, not Roman numerals. Number 1, why on earth did Cassie not have a gun? I know I already said I wanted this movie to be about her murdering these guys, which is not only because the marketing really, really leans into the promise of this as a revenge fantasy film when it definitionally is not that, but I want that, and I assumed it would be that, because when I think about the kind of man who is likely to inflict sexual violence onto a woman too drunk to consent, he would stop right away is nowhere near the list of next likely actions I think he might take upon realizing the woman in question is not intoxicated. If Cassie brought with her, on these little excursions with would-be assailants, a weapon of some sort, even if she didn't use it, even if Fennell continued to be too much of a coward to make her pretty blonde insert murderess like she should have been, I would be a little bit kinder to the realism of these scenes, but she doesn't. She doesn't even carry mace. Even if we still wanted to keep the bumbling idiot characterization for some of these guys, I feel like there could have been some kind of comedy found in her macing a guy and him stumbling around rubbing at his eyes. Instead, Cassie's protection comes from simply not being the kind of girl who would be assaulted, and by being written by someone who seems to think highly enough of even would-be rapist men to believe that they would stop if they were simply told to. The fact that we see these scenes play out multiple times with multiple men and they all just accept her lecture without continuing to try to assault her isn't just beyond my suspension of disbelief, but it leaves the film without anything meaningful to actually say about the culture that enables men like that. Cassie literally says none of the men ever still want to have sex with her upon realizing that she's sober. Does Fennell truly actually believe that being told no is a meaningful defense against sexual assault? Or did she just decide to make the men in her movie play by those rules for fear of alienating the men in her audience? I do almost wonder if this generosity to men, even the type of men who would seek out a drunk woman at a club and bring her back to their home with intentions of assaulting her, had something to do with all of the awards this movie was nominated for during that Oscar season. Nothing else really makes sense to me. The characterization of these men feels like exactly what a man who would be likely to do this sort of thing to a woman would like to believe about themselves. That they didn't know better, that they would have stopped if they were told that it was wrong to have sex with a woman too drunk to consent. That there's nothing violent about what they were doing, really, so no real danger involved in it. No harm, no foul. One of very few things I don't entirely hate about this movie is the casting of these men with previous credits as wholesome, earnest love interest types, which lends to a sort of false sense of security about their intentions until it's revealed that they do in fact mean to take advantage of Cassie's intoxication and step right into her lecture trap. It would be really cool if Fennell had actually managed to commit to the concept. A concept that she received a lot of accolades for at the time. Carrie Whitmer wrote for The Ringer, "These lovable, approachable, low-key internet boyfriends are famous enough that we're familiar with them, but not so famous that they can't go to Trader Joe's in peace. They're not Brad Pitt or Timothée Chalamet. And in Promising Young Woman, they've been cast intentionally by casting directors Lindsey Graham and Mary Verneau, and writer-director Emerald Fennell. What all these actors have in common is their wholesome roots. Their previous roles that make you feel at ease with their presence, even though in Promising Young Woman you know that they're bad or that they're about to do something bad. Their performances in the film, which emulate their previous roles but with a sinister twist, perfectly capture the film's message that anyone could be a predator and anyone could be complicit. She wants to be showing us these nice guys actually being sinister, but she fails at making them sinister or violent enough to put her lead in any real danger, and fails to allow her lead to enact any meaningful revenge on them. In a movie with posters that call it a revenge fantasy. In fact, in terms of how fucking pointless these lectures are, in what feels like a blink and you'll miss it little piece of dialogue toward the end of the film, when she tries another round of her drunk girl fake out routine, it appears that Adam Brody did tell his misogynist buddies at the club about his experience with Cassie, who he painted as crazy, not as giving him some sort of come to Jesus moment that made him stop trying to assault women. I guess that's the most realistic thing about this situation, though them not killing or hurting her for holding this mirror up to themselves is unrealistic enough that even that little line doesn't net anything more than an eye roll from me. But at least Fennell knows that Cassie's stupid-ass plan wouldn't even work. But I don't understand why we had to waste so much time on it if that's the case. Honestly, what makes this all the more annoying to me is that I know from Fennell's filmography that she does in fact have the stomach to make her lead character murderous. Sometimes, if it's a psycho, crazy, sexy, crazy bisexual queer person like in Saltburn, then it's fine. But not when they're her pretty, feminine, dainty self-insert character, who literally watches Fennell herself give a makeup tutorial in this movie. Like, it couldn't be more obvious that she sees herself in these blonde women she keeps casting in her movies. But the conversation about Fennell and queerness isn't happening in this video, because there's nothing even remotely queer-coded about this film, other than Laverne Cox's roughly 8 minutes of combined screen time as a barista, where she's given nothing to do other than to prop up the white lead. So, my suspicion that Emerald Fennell would like to call me a slur will have to wait for another day. Let's keep going. Number 2, this movie hates women, but has nothing interesting to say about them. In what I know is something Fennell must be very satisfied with herself about half of Cassie's grudges for her dead victim friend's treatments are against other women. The dean of the college that I mentioned earlier, and a woman she had been friends with, played by Alison Brie. I can't even remember this character's name because she had absolutely zero interiority. Cassie sets up this big evil plan with Allison, who she takes out to lunch and either drugs or just tricks into getting very, very drunk throughout their meal, while she herself doesn't actually drink, because remember, you don't get assaulted if you don't drink in Fennell's little cinematic universe here. I lean toward thinking Cassie slipped something into her drink because of a later line of dialogue about her learning in college how easy it is to slip something into somebody's drink, played as a sort of girl bossy mic drop moment in the very awful end of the movie we'll be talking about later, but it's not exactly explicit. I think you could read it either way. But there are 2 things about this lunch scene that I hate beyond just the maybe implied drugging. One of which being that between the dean and Alison Brie, Cassie doesn't seem to ever interact with any other woman who has been the victim of sexual violence, which feels unlikely if you know anything about statistics. And there could have been an interesting conversation to be had here about women victim blaming and disbelieving other women. But there's no depth given to the character of this former classmate. She says a few victim blaming 101 things about how things happen when you get too drunk, which I cannot stress enough is just straight up the conceit of the film as written by Emerald Fennell. So it feels like an insult to my intelligence to hear this told to me as if it's something other than this fake out drunk girl almost assault but not if she's sober plot. And this and the scene with the dean talking about not wanting to ruin a young man's life over allegations are pretty much the only 2 pieces of this movie trying to say anything meaningful about rape culture, both of which I think come with huge missed opportunities. Because do you know what I find to be the most common refrain from a woman minimizing another woman's assault? That she herself has experienced sexual violence and does not believe the other woman because her experience doesn't fully match her own, and she finds her own experience to have been more violent and more violating. I see this literally all the time, and this would have provided some much needed depth to the character, and also provided us with an example of a character who lived through trauma and at least got to survive and continue to be a person after it, if not even like a good one, just like that she got to survive at all. That doesn't happen. Instead, Cassie gets her drunk / maybe drugs her and then pays some random man to go into her hotel room with her. And because men are inherently trustworthy if you interact with them while you're sober, and Cassie was sober while interacting with him, she's able to just trust that this man who she hired to go be alone with a woman who she just intentionally made as vulnerable as possible won't do anything to her. And in what I think is another point toward Cassie drugging her, Alison Brie wakes up with a big period of missing time and spends days in a panic, traumatized by her assumption that something happened to her while she was drunk and alone in a hotel room with this man who Cassie hired. And the thing is, there is literally no way for Cassie to know that nothing has happened. But the movie is not interested in that possibility. So Cassie just lets Alison Brie spend a few days thinking the worst has happened before announcing that nothing happened after all. At which point Alison Brie gives her a very conveniently recorded video of her dead friend's assault, which she has kept on an old phone she kept around all these years. This is so fucked up. And sure, characters in movies can do fucked up things. I can even allow that the movie clearly does not think that Cassie's method of coping with her friend's death is healthy, but it just all betrays a level of trust in men. It feels so incongruent with the supposed messaging of this film. It betrays a lack of understanding of how common sexual assault is and how likely it would be that other women than Cassie's friend would have experienced it in their lifetime. And it betrays the movie's weird, uneven distribution of vengeance. Alison Brie didn't get a little lecture, she got traumatized for life. And you're telling me that Cassie couldn't have even maimed some of those guys? Couldn't have done some psychological torture on them like she does on the Dean when she abducts her teenage daughter, who probably wasn't even alive when Nina was assaulted, and either way had nothing to do with it, and pranks the Dean into believing that her daughter is being sexually assaulted. This movie is ass. Another example of Fennell's lack of depth of thought about sexual violence is how she handles the college aspect to all of this. This is apparently set in a universe where Title IX does not exist. A universe where a traumatized survivor would need to make the case that her assault should be taken seriously directly to the dean of the college, who would then hold her to the same standards of reasonable doubt that a court would. Which is, as my friend Schmouder put it, just misinformation that is designed to make people less likely to report. But the purpose of this in Fennell's film is twofold. One, it gives Cassie another woman to punish, because she enacts psychological violence on this woman too by abducting her teen daughter, as discussed. But two, and this is important for the ending of the movie, it moves the responsibility for refusing to prosecute rapists away from the police and onto the college itself, and also the later apologetic defense attorney. And Fennell had to do this because we're meant to take some kind of solace in the police coming at the end of the film to arrest the rapist at his own wedding. Because you're meant to turn your brain completely off when you enter the theater for an Emerald Fennell film, and if you don't think you should be asked to do that in order to think a movie is good, you're a misogynist jumping on a hate campaign or something. I'm sorry, if it makes you feel better, if Emerald Fennell came out tomorrow as a victim of sexual harassment, I think you know enough about me to know I would take her side even though I do not like this woman. What I can't defend is ass filmmaking, and this is ass filmmaking. Even if she's a woman. You know what? Even if she had said that this was her fantasy when she was 14, I would still think it was ass. I'm allowed to think that. She's allowed to be criticized. She has done a lot that is worthy of criticism, so let's continue. Point number 3, Bo Burnham. I think Bo Burnham's character is the single most egregious example of Emerald Fennell pulling a punch in this film. Bo plays this doctor that Cassie was in med school with before she dropped out, and he's very, very persistent in pursuing her despite her initial disinterest in him. He's pushy in this way where you keep wondering whether Fennell thinks it's romantic or if this might pay off somehow in the end. And something is paid off with Bo, but not anything that was actually set up by his repeated pushing at Cassie's boundaries and ignoring of her clear disinterest. The twist of the film is that Bo Burnham, who Cassie has by now come to trust, was in fact present during that conveniently filmed assault of her best friend. I don't hate this reveal. It's the second thing about this movie that I don't absolutely despise. I think it's a pretty good job to put the guy with the distinctive voice in a role where it's important that we recognize his voice from a video that we hear but don't see. And that brings me to the third and final thing I like about this movie, which is that we're not made to watch the assault, just to watch Cassie watch it. There's only so much credit I can give Fennell for that, for reasons I will unpack more during point 4, but it is at least something that I think was done somewhat thoughtfully. So, Bo Burnham was there and laughing during the assault, which he seems to barely even remember when Cassie confronts him about it. This is the closest I think the movie comes to actually meaningfully having something to say, maybe nice guys aren't all that nice or trustworthy after all sometimes. But it doesn't go far enough, I don't think. The more I think about what a wasted opportunity it was to set all that up about him being pushy and insistent and then not pay it off with anything more meaningful than being a bystander like Fennell was describing herself as, by the way, the more frustrated I get. So many of my complaints about this movie would be resolved if she had just committed to actually having Bo Burnham be a predator. If this film wanted to have anything meaningful to say other than girls who get drunk are asking for it, we should have seen our morally sober and therefore apparently unassaultable lead be at least nearly assaulted by her pushy boyfriend. That is so much more in line with how sexual violence typically plays out. It would not have felt out of character for the guy Burnham was playing, and it would have done so much to dispel the victim blaming takeaway that this film leaves us with otherwise. I genuinely cannot believe that that is not how she played it. I think this plotline was a missed opportunity of the highest order, and the fact that Fennell couldn't see that as she was drafting really works against any positive view I could have of her as a writer, as a feminist, or even just as someone who might have thought deeply about sexual violence.
It's the reluctance to even like be in the same room as the R word, I think. Yeah.
The only would-be assaulters in this would totally stop if they were told no, except maybe for the guy who assaulted her friend, but holy shit! I have to talk about how he's portrayed in his own section, so let me hold that for number 4. But actually villainizing Bo Burnham more than she did would have been such a simple fix for so many of the issues that this movie has. But Emerald Fennell is what? A coward. That's right. Now you're getting it. Part 4, Al Monroe. So, the way that this movie decided to frame Nina as rapist is among some of the more baffling decisions made by Emerald Fennell in this film. I know I've been moving through the movie fairly quickly, but the climax, after Cassie has been given the very convenient videotape of her friend's assault and then used it to blackmail Bo Burnham into telling her where Al Monroe's bachelor party is, Cassie dresses up in a sexy nurse costume and arrives at that party in order to basically die by suicide. We are supposed to take her as intending on dying that night. She does a lot of preparation so that the plot will continue to unfold even after she's dead, scheduling text messages and mailing the phone with the tape on it to the former defense attorney, in a twist that is a cross between Pretty Little Liars, 13 Reasons Why, and equally as embarrassing as both of them. I hate this, and I hate it for reasons I'm going to get more into in part 5, but I want to talk in this section about what happens in the movie prior to Cassie's murder. Cassie goes to this bachelor party, and while we're there, we finally meet Al, who we've only known by name and by deed so far in the film. And for reasons that are completely unknown to me, Fennell decides to play this character as though he has genuinely changed since his rapist days in college. I cannot fathom why she felt this was a necessary character note. Again, unless she was genuinely just pandering to the men in her audience and who might and would vote for her for awards. For whatever fucking reason, Al is devoted to his fiancée. In fact, he's very concerned about having a dancer at his party when he promised his soon-to-be wife that there would be no strippers. He repeatedly asks Cassie not to do anything. She tells him she won't be paid unless she goes upstairs with him, which I get that it's a movie, but that is very much not how strippers work. Anyway. Even when she's got Al upstairs, he's still very hesitant, asking her not to do anything or make him do anything, startled when she cuffs him to the bed with weak, breakable, fuzzy pink handcuffs she says are for her own safety. I just think one of a million very easy changes that Fennell could have made if she'd bothered a couple more passes at her draft for this movie would be to simply frame Al as though he is still a misogynistic sex bully. How simple would it have been to have him palm her ass on the way up the stairs, or be excited at the chance to get lucky with a dancer just before his wedding? Why did we have to see him as some changed nice guy? Instead, because this movie does not hate men, doesn't even really seem to distrust them whatsoever, Al is framed pretty sympathetically in this big pre-murder confrontation scene, down to the music cues in the movie seeming to be on his side, seeming to frame him as the victim and Cassie as the horror movie thriller monster. It makes no sense, and it undercuts any thesis that this film might have had. And, as I previously teased, Fennell also undercuts her previous good decision of not showing us the filmed sexual assault of Nina by making Cassie's death scene an extended, gratuitous, simulated sexual assault scene that we have to sit through. The framing of Al on top of Cassie as he smothers her with a pillow is unmistakable in what it is trying to evoke, upsetting in a visceral way even apart from the way that it closes the film off from any hope of catharsis or victory for Cassie. And as if that weren't all bad enough, following Cassie's death, the movie makes this sudden genre shift into a buddy comedy vibe when Schmidt from New Girl comes upstairs to discover her dead body on the bed beside Al, who hadn't managed to break the other handcuff the entire rest of the night, even though he knew that they were breakable because he had already broken one. My friend Little Shop of Allie said that this scene reminds her of a Tyler Perry movie, and she is, as usual, right about that. There is no catharsis, there is no relief, there is no revenge. The closest we get is the knowledge that Cassie foresaw her own murder, which is that why she picked the fuzzy handcuffs instead of something that would actually restrain him? It really reads as though she died on purpose, which brings me to my fifth point here. Number 5, this movie is pro-suicide. Fennell has gotten a lot of, in my opinion, unearned praise for the ending of this movie being all gritty and realistic. Helped by her talking about how her cop father-in-law helped her time out how long it would take for someone to die via suffocation, and then showing every second of that to us in lurid, leering detail. At a certain point, though, there are some things you just should not subvert, and subverting the concept of the heroine actually achieving any meaningful retribution in what you are literally marketing as a revenge fantasy film is so cheap as to just be infuriating. It's not clever at all, but it is overwhelmingly proud of itself for considering itself clever, which I have found to be a hallmark of an Emerald Fennell movie. The final twist in this film, after Al and Schmidt from New Girl have somehow managed to cremate Cassie's body in a campfire over a creek, even though that's definitely not how fires or cremation work, is that, as mentioned, Cassie already knew she was gonna die at the bachelor party. She's a promising young woman, after all. She had a plan. Not a plan to use proper restraints on Al, but a plan to try to achieve vengeance after her death, by getting the tape of the sexual assault into the hands of the police, and leading those same cops to interrupt Al's wedding and arrest him for suspicion of her murder there. And she posthumously gloats about this via scheduled texts to Bo Burnham. Like I said, Pretty Little Liars meets 13 Reasons Why, and we're, I suppose, meant to take this as Cassie's ultimate victory. Except, she's dead? She died. She doesn't actually get to see her master plan work itself out. She doesn't get to enjoy ruining Al's wedding. She is dead and she is murdered, and we had to watch that happen in excruciating detail. And frankly, it's hard to imagine that Cassie did more than just ruin this guy's wedding. He's arrested for her murder in the final moments of the movie, but are we really meant to believe that that will stick? How about once he tells the cops that she was stalking him, he was handcuffed to a bed, and she drugged all of his friends? Did Fennell think about that? No. This is what I meant earlier about her trying to preserve some level of faith in the police system in this film, even when it is completely unearned. There is absolutely no way that this rich white guy isn't getting away with it. He is going to plead self-defense and almost certainly win, and Cassie will have died for nothing. Died brutally and horrifically in a scene that the director of this movie tries to sell in interviews as a noble death. She says that male characters get to die noble deaths all the time. And I would love to know how many of those male characters die in simulated sexual assault scenes, because I feel like it's not as many as Fennell would have you believe when she tries to frame the extremely gendered way Cassie was murdered as some sort of feminist victory for equality.
Can you believe that? Can you believe that? Do you really believe that?
The final moments of the film, during a very overused and cliche needle drop of Angel of the Morning, when Bo Burnham is staring at his phone while Al is hauled away by the police, really nail in this pro-suicide messaging that Fennell either didn't think through or didn't see anything wrong with. Cassie signs off one of her very last text messages as being from both herself and her perfect dead victim friend, reunited in death, and apparently the happiest ending that Fennell could have imagined for her. It is so goddamn irresponsible that it makes my head spin. It's hard for me to conceive of how she could have possibly thought this was a good idea or even a remotely feminist piece of messaging. What this movie tells to survivors, the people it was marketing itself to by dressing itself up as a revenge fantasy movie, is that there is no hope of justice or sympathy unless they are dead, and also that once you die in pursuit of that justice and sympathy, it might bring with it a sense of vindication and satisfaction, and not you just not being around anymore, which is what happens when you die by suicide. And Fennell said that the alternate ending she imagined, where Cassie survived, was too terribly depressing. But this wasn't? This, one of the least satisfying endings of all time, less depressing than one where her traumatized lead got to survive. Because if we shove our head firmly up our ass and pretend like catching a charge for a murder you'll almost certainly get off the hook for is the same as facing justice for a sexual assault that remains unpunished in the narrative, we can pretend for like half a second before our brain starts working again like she told any sort of compelling story here. But she did not. I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's an ass movie. Clearly, I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks thinking about ways that this film could have been improved. But the biggest one, and I can't believe that this isn't just a joke I'm making to be mean, is that it needed to have more than one goddamn draft. Are you fucking joking me? In my research, I've learned that Fennell is very proud of herself for the fact that she does not do multiple drafts of her screenplay. Somehow, she has internalized that scripts are in fact worse once they have been drafted multiple times. So, letting a story live in your head and then shitting out exactly one draft that you don't revise is the purest way to tell a story. I find this genuinely insulting, and I pinky promise I would if a male director was kissing his own ass about the same thing too. The first draft is an important part of any writing process, yes. And also, if you are any good at what you're doing, it should be about, I don't know, like 40% of the time that you spend on your script. That Fennell didn't write multiple drafts, that she didn't revise, that she has so clearly been consistently told she's the most special and remarkable and creative woman of all time that it's precluded her from being able to see her own work with a critical eye. Like I said, it feels like something I would make up as a joke to be mean about her. Honestly, as does her saying the R word rather than any language that actually goes with the subject matter of what I increasingly view as a lazy and ultimately meaningless Me Too themed cash grab. I revise my YouTube videos. I've written this script like 3 times. I am not getting paid millions of dollars to make those YouTube videos, and I still put more effort into creating multiple drafts of my work than Fennell does for her deeply mediocre filmography. I think so many of my complaints with this movie would have very naturally been solved if, like an actual writer, Fennell had taken more than just one pass at her project, rather than just pushing everything out in one go NaNoWriMo style and calling it good enough because she had previously daydreamed about a drunk girl suddenly dropping her intoxicated facade and having a girl boss lecture moment to men who tried to do the R word to her. I can't help it. I feel genuinely insulted that I'm expected not only to take something seriously that someone can't bother to actually work on enough to work in drafts, but that I know that I'm going to get comment section dissertations about how I'm harming feminism by expecting better from women. Is it not misogynistic to pull our punches about this because Fennell is a woman? How on earth is the idea that just because she's a woman we can only expect so much from her anything other than benevolent sexism? I'm sure that those multi-paragraph comments have already been written by people who will not even make it this far into the video, but if you're kind enough to hold off and actually hear what I'm saying before you reacted to the concept of a woman being criticized, I would like to remind you that the woman I am criticizing is infinitely more wealthy and privileged than I am. And so if it's cruel to criticize a woman who has taken home multiple Oscars for her movies, it must be extra super not allowed for you to criticize a woman who just had to crowdfund to avoid eviction a couple months ago, right? Or do I need to tell you that this video was my fantasy when I was a teenager in order to get that kind of pass? Just let me know. Anyway, I wanted to give you a quick rundown of things that have popped up in my writer brain as I've drafted and redrafted this video essay more times than Fennell sees fit to draft her films. Let's talk about just a few of the things that I think could have been done to make this film more coherent. You know, assuming it had aims to do anything other than hollow out the aesthetics and feminist credit of the Me Too movement and wear it like a fancy fur coat. First of all, and this one is a little bit petty, but I am meant to understand Cassie as a woman who is on the edge. You know, she's traumatized and destroyed, devastated by the loss of her friend who doesn't matter to the narrative in any significant form beyond this. And though the script points out a few places where she's meant to be looking worn and rough, those don't exist in the movie. It does not come across. There's a reason I'm wearing all my most feminine clothes in this video, and it is to be a bitch. Cassie is hyper feminine the entire time, one way or the other. Pretty, dainty, pink and floral girl next door coded in every scene in her regular day-to-day life, including when she's sitting around in her parents' McMansion and when she's working at the coffee shop job she's clearly terrible at. There's supposed to be some kind of dichotomy going on here, some kind of visual contrast between these pretty dainty outfits and her glittery club outfits when she goes out to entice men into assaulting her, but actually it's all just very extremely hyper feminine. There's no real contrast. This movie isn't brave enough to actually show us Cassie looking like any sort of a mess. If I were making this movie and I meant for there to be some kind of visual distinction between her femme not so fatale, lecture mommy mode, and her sad, depressed barista life, I might have made such brave costuming choices as having her wear t-shirts sometimes, letting her not have 3 layers of foundation on her face on her dates with Bo Burnham or alone in her bedroom at her parents' McMansion. I would have had her hair be a mess. And I don't mean a mess in the way of the world's most hideous rainbow wig in her male gaze sexy nurse costume, but a mess as in maybe she doesn't brush it when she's home and alone and not being observed by men she wants to view her as a target. But that would have troubled the aesthetics of the film, which seemed to be the most important part of the film. This movie is much, much more concerned with having a pretty feminine pastel candy wrapper than it is with actually showing anything that it's congratulating itself for talking about. It sucks. Also, there's actually a bit in the script where Fennell pauses in that first and only draft she wrote to praise herself for how when Cassie is in her male gaze fantasy nurse outfit and hideous wig, the audience doesn't get to see what they really want, which is her stripping. But like, okay, Fennell, sure. As if there's none of that same gratification she's praising herself for dodging in the audience seeing Cassie dressed like this in the first place. Okay, Fennell, you are so subversive for not having her take her clothes off. You're right. Did we maybe think about the implications of having a woman dressed and posed as a sex worker being the victim of femicide as much as we thought about how nice it is that we don't see her actually do that sex work? No, clearly we did not. Another thing I would have done would be to invest any of my screen time whatsoever, except for the maybe 8 minutes of screen time Laverne Cox is given, into actually showing a positive relationship between Cassie and other women. She does, in classic Fennell tell don't show dialogue, tell Bo Burnham that Laverne Cox is a great friend. Are we shown this? No, of course not. Is there any indication that Fennell considered that maybe the black trans woman character she added to her otherwise overwhelmingly white roster of characters could have had some sort of intimate experience with sexual violence, either from her own life or from the life of other trans women she might have spoken to? Nope. Laverne's character is siloed away completely from any of the attempts at commentary that this movie makes. My friend Marty pointed out that this character is written basically interchangeably with any sassy gay friend stereotype, and it is so true that it makes me grind my teeth. Also, on top of, and only slightly related to this, Fennell seems to be addicted to using the word female in interviews to describe this movie. Not feminine, which would at least explain why Cassie is constantly serving high femme realness the whole way through, even when she's supposed to be having a series of mental breakdowns, but female, something that is impossible for me to not read as heavily bioessentialist. It's not great, all put together. But I guess that's just my 6-word review of the movie as a whole at this point. And lest you think that the whole not being able to picture a person of color as the love interest in Wuthering Heights and underutilizing Laverne Cox to a degree that's frankly criminal was the end of the list in terms of Fennell clearly having a lot of goddamn work to do in how she portrays the people of color she deigns to cast in her films, I just think you should know that the one and only would-be assailant that she goes out of her way to call ugly is, of course, the only one of them who is a black man. He's also portrayed as, like, this whiny little baby who lives with his parents and literally runs away crying after their parking lot confrontation, but for sure, the Heathcliff casting happened in a vacuum, and anybody who was raising red flags about that is just overreacting or whatever. I totally believe you. If I were writing this movie, I would have given Laverne Cox's character a lot more to do. Honestly, I would have allowed her to come and save Cassie at the end, but somewhere in the middle of that first and only draft, Fennell got it into her head that any ending where Cassie survived would be too depressing. So she didn't consider mirroring Cassie's tell don't show love for Nina into a relationship with another woman. Laverne just gets the Cassie half of a friendship necklace Cassie and Nina shared with no note after Cassie is murdered. And that's her arc, other than being the sassy gay friend who I don't think is even supposed to be gay because she had a boyfriend or husband in the script. That's her whole role. It sucks. There's a lot about this movie that could have been done better had Cassie been able to bond or even just interact with other women in a way that didn't have to do with either having a magical black barista to be sassy to her surgeon boyfriend or her dedication to her perfect victim dead best friend. For example, early on in the film, when Cassie learns that Bo Burnham's character is still friends with the men from college who were present or a part of her best friend's assault, there's a throwaway line, both in the script and the finished film, where, upon telling Cassie that Al is going to get married, Bo Burnham says, "God help her," about Al's future wife, who we do not see until the wedding scene at the end of the film, and who we really never learn anything about beyond her profession as a bikini model. How much better would this movie have been if Cassie had attempted to seek out this fiancé and warn her about her soon-to-be husband's history? Personally, I would have completely swapped out the whole Madison revenge plotline for this. You have Cassie worm her way into the bikini model fiancé's life, attempt to warn her about Al being a bad guy, and find herself completely shut down. I mean, Nina's allegations made it all the way to court, after all, before she was bullied into dismissing them. It's not hard for me to imagine that Al could have told his fiancée some self-exonerating version of this story. "When I was in college, some crazy bitch tried to make false allegations against me." Like, that would have made so much sense. The fiancé, being the one to defend Al here and victim blame Nina, would have been much better, and Cassie wouldn't have had to try to arrange some kind of psychological torture on her. Because, if you ask me, the natural conclusion of that plotline would have been to have the fiancé disbelieving Cassie until her soon-to-be fiancé attempts to force himself on her, at which point she finds Cassie again, tells her she believes her and is sorry, and wants to know what they can do to take this guy down. Holy shit! That would have made for a much more compelling conversation about victim blaming and the different way that someone might feel about that after their own experiences than the mess we got in the movie. I think about this, and I get so mad that it's not the movie we got. But because the fiancé is essentially a non-character, not even someone Cassie seems to be worried about, Bo Burnham's "God help her" is just a weird dangling thread that Fennell didn't see fit to pay off. And it sucks. It especially sucks because, as I already discussed, the movie sort of frames Al as though he has changed and really loves his fiancée. We could have seen that same kind of characterization paired with a gut punch realization that he hadn't actually changed. Which, generously, I guess that's what him smothering Cassie is supposed to be, I guess. Although he didn't murder Nina, so actually him being full-on murderous at this point is an escalation from his college days. I also would have gender-swapped the dean and the defense attorney. Walk with me here. Rather than Cassie orchestrating some kind of a sexual assault fake-out on Alison Brie's character, Madison, we could actually get some kind of reasoning for why the defense attorney has so suddenly abandoned their former career and now lives with such regret. As it is in the film, he just tells Cassie that he had what he thinks was an epiphany and his doctors think was a mental breakdown. There's not even an attempt at explaining why this happened. That does not matter. Clearly, what mattered to Fennell in this scene was Cassie offering absolution to this man for being manipulatively apologetic to her and half remembering Nina's name. Also a very gendered aspect to Cassie's characterization in this film. For all of the self-congratulatory hot air about how men in movies get to be exactly like this that Emerald Fennell blows in the direction of her own skirt, imagine if Keanu Reeves had to forgive the guy who killed his dog in that movie because he half remembered the dog's name. Nobody does this to their male characters. It is offensive to my intelligence to pretend like they do. And so instead, I think we could have seen the former defense attorney as a woman who was racked with guilt either because of a personal experience she might have had being on the other side of sexual violence suddenly, or even just because of the cultural conversation around the Me Too movement at the time, or literally fucking anything other than the lazy-ass epiphany/mental breakdown description given by the man. She could be sorry. We could have seen a woman be sorry and be forgiven, but we didn't. Because, what did I say earlier? This movie hates women but doesn't have anything interesting to say about them. And the dean. This is just assuming we still want to keep the awful scene where she abducts a teenage girl and stashes her away somewhere for her parent to assume that they're being assaulted. But I just feel like the "what if it was your daughter" argument is so much more often effectively deployed on men than it is on women, who likely already do love people who were victims of sexual assault. This could have been a commentary on how fucked up it is that that's regularly how men are asked to care about sexual violence in the real world. This also would have entirely eliminated my "how come only women are getting psychological warfare waged against them" complaints. Although not my "a dean is just not the one you report sexual assault to" critique. That one remains. But, can I expect a Brit to research Title IX? I don't know. I also, and this probably ought to go without saying, I would have seen fit to allow Cassie to survive the end of the film, whether this was by changing the final showdown between her and Al, or having Laverne Cox or Al's fiance or both there to save her and get her out. It doesn't really matter. This film would have been less of a betrayal to so many people I know and have spoken to if Cassie had not been murdered for the sake of realism. In interviews, Fennell seems to love to say that she just started thinking as she was drafting about how if a woman was in a room in a violent altercation with a man, that there's no other way it could have ended other than him becoming more violent than her and murdering her. Which, okay, I love the implication here that she figured this out halfway through scripting and thus after all of the stupid lecture scenes, but then didn't go back to fix those. That's really funny. But also, she says in these same interviews that she just doesn't think it's realistic for women to resort to violence. And that's bioessentialism once again. And also, does she think it's realistic for a woman to go out and rape bait at a club? I'm very sorry for using that word. I have limited it to just the once in the script because I hate it so much, but it is the most effective term for what she has had Cassie spend most of her intervening years between leaving college and the start of the film doing. And, obviously this is all assuming that we allow Cassie to enact any kind of actual revenge, but you could still end the movie with an arrest if that's what's important to her, that we justify the police. Which it very well might be. Like I said, she's got a cop father-in-law. Cassie could get arrested, could smirk at the camera rather than in a posthumous texted winky face to Bo Burnham. Cassie could still be driven by her revenge, consumed by it in a way that would lead her to an ending that isn't uniformly happy and satisfying, but that she herself could take some kind of satisfaction in. And it could have not had the message be that the way to achieve precarious and unlikely justice is to allow yourself to be murdered in pursuit of it. Please God, somebody give Fennell a script supervisor next time she decides to do one of these movies. If I could make her movie this much better without any actual script writing experience outside of my silly YouTube videos in my bedroom, imagine what an actual feminist in the room could have done for a promising young woman. We deserved that. We deserved to have an actual feminist in the room telling this story so much more than we deserve to tell each other that it's sexist to have high expectations for something made by a woman. Alright, so Fennell did not see fit to focus on Nina, but I would like to do that here for a couple of minutes, and I want to do so by showing you something from the script that is the most significant thing we ever get to learn about Nina as a person. Mostly so that you understand I was not being facetious at all earlier when I told you that her only real characterization is that she was completely hollowed out and destroyed by experiencing sexual assault in college. I think any differences between this one draft script and Mulligan's actual monologue in the movie are pretty negligible. As written, in the scene where Cassie is about to attempt to carve Nina's name into Al's chest, but actually get graphically and brutally murdered, she says,
"Shh, I want you to know what she was like, okay? But she's so difficult to explain because she was just so completely herself. Even when she was 4 years old, she was fully formed from day one. Same face, same walk, and funny like a grown-up was funny. Kind of. Shrewd, perceptive, so smart. I was just in awe of her. I couldn't believe she wanted to be my friend. She didn't give a fuck what anyone else thought except for me, because she was just Nina. And then she wasn't. Suddenly she was something else. She was yours. It wasn't her name she heard when she was walking around. It was yours. Your name all over her, all around her, all the time. And it just squeezed her out. So when I heard your name again, your filthy fucking name, I wondered when was the last time someone had said hers, or thought about it even, apart from me.
Alright, I'm not doing a cinema sins for this whole deeply troubled rhetoric here, but we had a whole scene with Molly Shannon, who played Nina's mother, that I guess just means nothing here in the context of this speech. Like, I think her mom probably also has thought her name about as often as Cassie has, but that goes against Fennell's idea of whatever the fuck is going on here between those two. Before we finish this monologue, I do think this piece from the New York Times by Lena Wilson summed up the issue really, really well.
Despite her importance to the narrative, Nina never comes into focus. She's dead, but we never learn how she died. We don't even know what she looked like as an adult, since the only pictures we see of her come from Cassie's childhood. Nina's fiery personality shines through in glimpses, an anecdote her mother tells, a speech Cassie delivers to the rapist, but ultimately the movie perpetuates the very wrong it condemns, turning a woman who was fully formed from day one into little more than the worst night of her life.
And it made me so sad, because Al, you should be the one with her name all over you.
No.
Don't worry, I've sterilized everything. I really would have been a great doctor.
You're insane.
You know what? I honestly don't think I am. The fuck did I just read? What is this?
Like, we see the issue with this messaging, right? I mean, here more than in much of the rest of the movie, I can at least see what Fennell was going for. And I suppose I'll allow that it's a difficult tightrope to walk between showing the impacts trauma can have on someone's life, which can be very, very damaging and permanent, and also presupposing that they are completely destroyed permanently by their assault. But I don't think this monologue does a whole lot of balancing. I think it kind of head dives into the purity culture assertion that being touched by, or having sex with, or in this case, being assaulted by a man permanently changes a woman. And in this case, not even just changes her into chewed up bubble gum or a flower with the petals picked off, but it completely destroys her and hollows her out from the inside to make room for her assaulter instead, who now permanently owns her. Don't love that. I don't find that to be particularly useful rhetoric, and especially not when this isn't how Nina herself is describing it. Because, again, Nina is hardly a feature in this plot. As Mary Beth McAndrews wrote in On the Disempowerment of Promising Young Women,
every move Cassie makes is in memory of Nina. Every punishment is enacted because of Nina. Everything is about Nina. But Nina's voice is never heard. She is a ghost, silently floating at the periphery, talked about not to. Yes, this is a film about Cassie's grieving process, but that comes at the price of a sexual assault survivor being stripped of her personhood. There is a statement to be made about how that was already done by the entire patriarchal system. No one remembers her name, a man was prioritized over her well-being, the list goes on. But without any further introspection from the film about that idea, the construction of Nina becomes flimsy. She becomes an idea that Cassie has based her entire identity around, rather than a full human being. Even Nina's mother, Molly Shannon, tells Cassie to move on for all of us, which can be interpreted for both the living and the dead. While Cassie's grief shouldn't be dismissed, it should be examined as something harmful to the sexual assault victim herself. Promising Young Woman doesn't grapple with the ramifications of Cassie deeming herself the avenging angel without Nina's explicit consent, and in fact doesn't even consider the concept of consent outside of the world of sex. With Nina disappearing into the narrative, Cassie centers Nina's trauma on herself and how she has dealt with not only Nina's death, but her rape. In turn, this is a violation of their friendship, as Cassie claims to be acting for Nina when she is really acting for herself. Nina has no say in if this is what she wants, and her agency is again stripped away. It is by no means as egregious as rape, but still deserves to be discussed, especially as Promising Young Woman works to address the slippery slope of revenge.
You might have already gotten this from Cassie drugging those guys, and also maybe Alison Brie, or from that careful tiptoeing around actual phrasing, like in that "had sex with her repeatedly" quote I read you earlier. But for all that this movie wants to be examining consent, or wants to congratulate itself for being about that, it doesn't truly seem to be concerned with it. At least not concerned enough to say the word, or to be curious about how Nina would feel either with Cassie's avenging plotline or with her forgiveness of the defense lawyer who seemingly drove her in part to dying by suicide after she was bullied into dropping her case against Al Monroe. And I didn't put this in my script doctor segment, but I think there are a few possible ways that the problems I have with Nina's non-presence in this story might have been solved. For one, we could have done something probably somewhat corny, but probably not impossible to pull off, where Nina exists not even just in flashback format, which could have happened, but is something Fennell did not find time to incorporate in the film, but in a sort of Fight Club-esque mental image projection Cassie is doing. Maybe Nina is present throughout the film, visually spurring Cassie on in this quest for vengeance. Though that doesn't seem particularly likely, considering Fennell sees this as a movie about forgiveness somehow. So maybe instead, Nina would take the form of a concerned friend, asking Cassie not to do these things. Like, maybe it's a plot twist partway through the film that Nina has actually been dead all along. Or maybe Nina is just Cassie's own extrapolation of her trauma. I do have to credit that idea to my friend Marty McFlone, who said it first when we were discussing the film. A lot of this narrative would have been a lot cleaner, considering how little Nina would go on to mean in the movie, if she had actually just been Cassie's way of fictionalizing and distancing herself from her own trauma and what had been done to her. Or even a twist where they were both assaulted in the same incident, rather than, again, Cassie's characterization seeming to be that she's just not the kind of girl who gets assaulted, unlike her perfect victim dead friend, who is really granted nothing other than her victimhood in the narrative. Instead, written as it is, this plotline falls remarkably impressively flat. It would be funny if it weren't so self-congratulatory. Hey, there's another one-sentence Fennell review. I wish there was more that I could say about Nina other than just how botched this plotline is, but there really isn't. There's not much to go on. We spend a tiny bit of time with her mother, who begs Cassie to move on, and Nina appears only in a framed picture of her and Cassie in childhood and on a slideshow of photos on Cassie's laptop. The only actual assault victim in this film is confined to the other half of a best friend's necklace Cassie wears, and as a motivation for a didactic plotting story that cloaks itself as a revenge fantasy, but is truly Fennell's fantasy of getting to tell you, the viewer, how destructive she finds the concept of revenge, or seemingly even anger at the systems that uphold this sort of sexual violence. A movie about forgiveness. And you marketed it as a rape revenge movie. And you did it at my birthday dinner. I already briefly mentioned this with Fennell's treatment of the single black would-be assailant played by Sam Richardson when he runs away crying after their parking lot confrontation, during which Cassie tells him that some other girl, who actually does get to live in a rape revenge movie, carries scissors with her. But the way that men and their emotions are portrayed in this movie is very, very odd. And I know I've already touched on my frustration with the assertion that every would-be rapist would have totally stopped if they were explicitly told no. I think I should take a moment to allow here that that's probably at least sometimes true. I had a great discussion over on my Patreon with a commenter who brought up that a lot of sexual assault does happen within the plausible deniability that she didn't say no offers to somebody who is still obviously violating consent. And I do think that's a reasonable note amongst my frustration here. That is a thing in real life. But what I don't find reasonable is that this is how every instance of sexual violence in this film was portrayed. Or, frankly, that the lack of explicit force and this willingness to continue violating that lack of consent even without it isn't exactly portrayed as itself an act of violence in this movie. My issue with these confrontations isn't just that Cassie doesn't carry a weapon or seem particularly concerned with finding a way to defend herself should things escalate, but that when you sit and watch the film, the first thing that happens that feels outright framed by the narrative as an act of violence is when Cassie smashes a guy's car up after he calls her names for being parked in the road in such a way that isn't even really blocking his path or anything. The next, and the only real act of violence against a human being in this movie, would be Cassie's attempt at carving Nina's name into the chest of Al Monroe, who, as discussed, then murders her in a very graphic manner, meaning the only violence in the movie is against our protagonist. And it just makes me wonder, in conjunction with Fennell's refusal to actually engage with the R word, how violent she even really sees what these men were attempting to do to Cassie after she baited them into taking her home. Is this really understood by the film as an act of sexual violence? Or is there some kind of distinction going on in Fennell's mind between all of her euphemistic taking advantage of and outright sexual violence? To cite from Rain again, and once more dedicate more time to research than Fennell seems to have seen fit, only 11% of rapes are committed with a weapon of some sort, and that does not mean that the other 81% are no longer sexual violence. It doesn't justify her cowardly depiction of these almost assaults as almost ultimately nonviolent acts. I personally would go so far as to argue that even sexual assault done to a victim who gave coerced consent still absolutely counts as violence. And it feels a little bit jarring to realize that that might not be an opinion I share with a woman who took it upon herself to make an entire movie about this concept. But the thing I couldn't help noticing on my second and subsequent rewatches of this movie was another element to how these would totally definitely stop men are portrayed. This repeated theme of a really weird and overblown sort of humiliation they go through. We don't see every man do this. In fact, we don't see how Adam Brody reacts to his lecture at all, cutting instead to the cutesy heart title screen and that fake out as though she killed him, while a remix of It's Raining Men plays and Cassie stares down a set of construction workers who catcall her for being on a walk of shame the next morning, which... does that imply that she spent the night? It was still evening when she went back to Adam Brody's apartment with him. How long did her lecture last that night? Because it didn't seem to take very long to be over with the one we got to see in full when she goes home with McLovin. But whatever, it's the next morning. It's not just Sam Richardson's character running away crying, living with his parents, and getting portrayed as a total loser. Once you notice it, it becomes hard to unsee how often we see men crying in this movie, which I'm typically totally down for. It just doesn't work here. It's not done in a way that makes me feel satisfied or as though Cassie has inflicted any real revenge on these men, but in this way where it sort of makes me feel like Fennell believes the most she could degrade a man would be by subjecting them to tearful humiliation. We also see another form of this with the lawyer asking for Cassie's forgiveness and being granted it, because he went through the worst trial a man will ever face in an Emerald Fennell movie. He had to cry, and in front of a woman. It's very weird. Weirder when we don't see any of the women cry. Weirdest that I believe this sight of various men crying, Paul, the lawyer, Al Monroe weeping in bed and being comforted by Schmidt from New Girl after he's committed femicide against an ostensible sex worker, feels like it's meant to be understood as on par with the psychological torture we saw Cassie put the various women in this movie through. This, like so many things in the movie, does not do exactly what I believe Fennell thinks it does. It's a weird, jarring tone to take in a film that feels like it missed some pretty obvious opportunities to truly condemn these earlier actions of these men. Like, perhaps I'm supposed to watch this and laugh and revel in their misfortune, find them less of a man taken down a peg by their tears, but that's not how my brain works. I suppose there's a brief hint of satisfaction I can find in Cassie pausing on her way out of McLovin's apartment to tell him that his novel sounds terrible, maybe, but in practice, this whole theme just feels off. Especially with the scene with that former defense attorney, whose tears are, I assume, meant to scan to me as a truly remorseful man. What they really land as, though, as Cherry Bepsy said in her video about this movie, is something more along the lines of an influencer cry-typing an apology after being called out for racism. Manipulative and empty, like he was waiting to give that performance the moment he was called out. And like it's just a box to check off, a necessary step to going back to his life. His man tears are so effective that Cassie calls off what appears to be a hitman she hired with her barista salary, who makes sure that he'll still be paid even though Cassie decided that the lawyer man's tears and half remembering of Nina's name was sufficient payment for his sins. So sufficient that he's the one that she entrusts the film of Nina's assault to. Not Laverne Cox, who, as I've already discussed, is just criminally underutilized in this film, due to Nina being the only woman with any narrative heft granted to her. What I think I am being asked to take away from these men crying is that they have, in fact, been punished. This is the worst punishment for a man. Either worse than a woman being made to believe she's been assaulted / her daughter is being assaulted, or at least just as bad and on par. Except, like, y'all don't cry? I've cried like 5 times already this week. If I were the villain in a revenge movie, I would hope that the punishment the narrative inflicted on me would be worse than just my standard behavior during a doctor's appointment. It doesn't feel as though we're shown these men crying in an intentional attempt at humanizing them, but that's how it ultimately comes across when, at least in the case of the former defense attorney, it does outright grant him explicit absolution from Cassie. I feel as though Fennell believed that this was her giving these men what they deserved. Like, she thinks that humiliating them is all the narrative satisfaction needed when you make this kind of film, which is a misunderstanding of the entire genre she was attempting to subvert here, but that's its own chapter. This humiliation theme is where, even though to be clear, I believe pretty much every man who had complaints to make about feeling isolated by this movie is in fact a big whiny baby, who didn't understand the great lengths this film was going to pander to exactly their type, I do somewhat understand the implication, sometimes made in very, very different sources of criticism of this film than my own, where certain anti-feminist and likely incel crowds felt as though the movie was man-hating. I disagree, but I kind of see where it's coming from. Which, to be clear, this movie is not. It is not man-hating. As I've already said, ultimately this movie neither hates men or distrusts them, but it does treat them strangely, and while I think it does overall pander to their approval and eventual Oscar votes, I think that there's this sort of amused framing at what Fennell seems to view as much putting in their place as she's comfortable doing to these men, and that's where those complaints are coming from, maybe? Which, and this is also very reflected in my criticisms of Barbie, which similarly failed at having any real teeth. At this point, you should just go all the way. I would love to see one of these big release pseudo-feminist films actually just commit. Because I think if you know you're making something that's going to get decried as man-hating, you should also know that no level of apologetics toward those men will truly protect you from getting that criticism. Something just being about a woman at all is enough for it to be given man-hating allegations. So just go ahead. Make a man-hating movie. At this point, that would be fucking refreshing. In this movie, I would have loved to see a man harmed on a level that strikes me as more deep than just reputational harm or harm to his perceived masculinity. And though I don't get it, Fennell certainly still made the men who would have been angry about anything that pretended to speak about sexual violence just as angry without saying anything meaningful as she would have had she actually managed to commit to the genre she marketed this film as. I've been venting my frustrations with the misleading marketing for this film throughout the video, but I really would have regretted not breaking it out into its own chapter if I left it at that. You already know by now how exhausted I am at the mismatch between the movie that was released and the movie that was marketed. Something that, again, as pointed out over on my Patreon, feels like a bit of a hallmark of a Fennell movie. This isn't really a video about the rest of her filmography, but just to bear that point out a little bit more. Wuthering Heights, a movie she tried to warn us about, even with just the use of borderline sarcastic quotation marks around her title not being truly an adaptation of Bronte's novel, marketed itself not just as though it might actually care about its source material more than it did, but also as though it was some big romance love story. It was given a Valentine's Day release, for God's sake. And this is only the most recent in her entire lineup, which all falls into this in some way or another. Saltburn framed itself as both a gay obsession movie, which it's not. The movie literally begins with a no-homo monologue given by Sabrina Carpenter's ex-boyfriend. And also as an eat the rich movie, despite failing to convey that on just about every conceivable level, including, sorry, spoiler alert, the twist being that the one character we're supposed to see as part of the supposed underclass actually has plenty of money the whole time. And then, of course, Promising Young Woman framed itself not only as a feminist film, despite its unwillingness to engage with the R word, but also, fairly explicitly, it framed itself as a rape-revenge movie. There's been a lot of ink spilled about the very concept of a rape-revenge movie. Whether they are inherently feminist, if we should find them particularly empowering, those are genuinely interesting conversations to me, and ones that I would love to explore more in the future. But I think the thing that I'm most interested here in this video is just the fact that it exists at all. Rape revenge is a genre of film, and like all genres, it carries with it certain conventions, standards, and expectations. Horror itself carries these expectations maybe most of all, as discussed by Carol J. Clover in Chapter 3 of Men, Women, and Chainsaws.
In fact, horror's system of sympathies transcends and pre-exists any given example. Patrons of a slasher film or a rape revenge film know more or less what to expect well before the film rolls, and at least one horror director, William Friedkin, has suggested that their emotional engagement with the movie begins while they are standing in line, a proposition that acknowledges the profoundly formulaic nature of the enterprise. And as anyone who sees horror at the right venue, designated mall or downtown matinees, can attest, horror audiences can be startlingly competent, in the linguistic sense, and startlingly public about it. As Andrew Britton describes it, it became obvious at a very early stage that every spectator knew exactly what the film was going to do at every point, even down to the order in which it would dispose of its various characters. And the screening was accompanied by something in the nature of a running commentary, in which each dramatic move was excitedly broadcast some minutes before it was actually made. The film's total predictability did not create boredom or disappointment. On the contrary, the predictability was clearly the main source of pleasure, and the only occasion for disappointment would have been a modulation of the formula, not the repetition of it. Everyone had parted with his or her $4 in the complete confidence that Hell Night was a known quantity, and that it would do nothing essentially different from any of its predecessors. Everyone could guess what would happen, and it did happen. In the course of the evening, art had shrunk to its first cause, and I had the incongruous sense, on coming out, of having been invited to participate in communion. This highly ritualized and formulaic character, he concludes, is the most striking feature of the contemporary entertainment film. Although many folklorists disown horror movies as products too mediated by technology, authorial intention, and the profit motive to be seen as folklore in any authentic sense, the fact is that horror movies look like nothing so much as folktales, a set of fixed tale types that generate an endless stream of what are in effect variants, sequels, remakes, and rip-offs. Basically, sequels mean the same film, observes director John Carpenter. Who should know? That's what people want to see. They want to see the same movie again. Audiences may thrill to the killer's particular shtick, his hockey mask or knife fingers or whatever, or to the special effect that shows a bloody stump up close. Surface effects are the stuff of fanzines, but the structure, functions, or subject positions and narrative moves are as old as the hills. Much of the commentary on horror has concerned itself with mapping the cinematographic moves that are presumed to be constitutive of identification. Horror movies rub our noses in camera work, but it is important to remember that in a large or gross or deep structural sense, the identifications of horror are already in place, installed long before the individual movie was even a glint in the director's eye. Camera work may play with the terms, but it does not set them. The very fact that the cinematic conventions of horror are so easily and so often parodied would seem to suggest that, individual variation notwithstanding, its basic structures of apperception are fixed and fundamental. The same is true of the stories they tell. Students of folklore or early literature recognize in horror the hallmarks of oral narrative, the free exchange of themes and motifs, the archetypal characters and situations, the accumulation of sequels, remakes, imitations. This is a field in which there is, in some sense, no original, no real or right text, but only variants. A world in which, therefore, the meaning of the individual example lies outside itself. The art of the horror film, like the art of pornography, is to a very large extent the art of rendition or performance, and it is understood as such by the competent audience. Our particular example may have original features, but its quality as a horror film lies in the way it delivers the cliché.
Fennell, much like her teasing at and then abandoning of the ideas of other themes, like an Eat the Rich movie, appears to at least be aware of the standard ingredients of a rape revenge movie. And as I've already discussed, I do like exactly one of her subversions. Many rape revenge movies tend towards salacious or exploitative depictions of the sexual violence itself. Carol J. Clover discusses this more at length in her excellent essay collection. The differences in framing that help us to see from the perspective of the victims or that ask us to identify with the assailants themselves. This is also a reason why there's so much discourse around this genre as a whole. Can the empowerment of the revenge seeker truly outweigh the exploitation of seeing the assault depicted in the first place? Feminists are divided, just as they are about everything. I do believe that it's possible for a good and meaningful rape revenge film to be made without forcing us to bear witness to the assault itself. That's why I think it's important for me to give Emerald Fennell one single flower for not making us witness Nina's assault. This is the one and only good subversion I believe she made in this film. But obviously it wasn't her only subversion here. Fennell didn't just subvert an aspect of the rape part, she subverted the entirety of the revenge component. Cassie's fake-out, not really drunk and don't you feel so bad lectures to these men are simply not revenge. Not in any meaningful way, and certainly not in a way that would be satisfactory to the moviegoers who anticipated that the thing they bought tickets for was going to actually be the thing they paid to watch. And at a certain point, especially after the amount of reading I've done by now from articles and books by women who did deeply interrogate rape revenge as a genre, this refusal to live up to any of her own promises just becomes exhausting and a little insulting, as though someone is taking you by the hand to lecture you for desiring not even just a better movie, but the movie that you were promised in the first place. The rape revenge genre feels pretty widely understood to be one of catharsis, a sort of wish fulfillment, an externalization of the rage and frustration of living in a world that so routinely minimizes the impacts and trauma of sexual violence. And this seems to be part of why so many filmmakers in this genre, even the women, even the ones aiming to make explicitly feminist work, take the time to show the assault in the first place. However we feel about the effectiveness of that sort of scene. Done well, or at least done competently, the purpose of these scenes depicting sexual assault is that they are condemnatory. We are meant to watch it and understand and identify with our heroine's quest to seek justice later. This is also why I believe that the most effective rape revenge movies are the ones that, unlike Fennell, see fit to allow the victim of the assault be the one to enact their own revenge. With Nina having disappeared into the narrative for all but Cassie's driving motivation, as we've already discussed, this leaves the movie Fennell actually made in an odd, awkward spot. Nina is not there for us to empathize with. We see Cassie as traumatized by her friend's assault and subsequent death, but we also consistently see her as being in the wrong, because this movie that explicitly marketed itself as a rape revenge movie, is not a revenge movie at all. And because of Fennell's refusal to ever explicitly use the word,
it's the reluctance to even be in the same room as the R word, I think. Yeah.
I feel pretty confident in saying that this is not a rape movie either. Not really. And so then, what are we left with? I know that I've already used the word didactic to explain the film Fennell ended up making, and I don't even think being didactic is an inherently bad thing. But I think the thing that you should be concerned about being didactic about in your rape revenge movie is the idea that sexual violence is bad, not that revenge is bad. The movie frankly feels angrier with Cassie for being traumatized and engaging in self-destructive behaviors with the men who bring her home from bars than it does with the men for being the sorts of guys who would sexually assault her. It's so upset with Cassie for seeking actual violence and her attempted revenge against Al that it kills her for it. Narratively punishes the only woman who matters to the plot for seeking to answer his violence against her friend with violence of her own, and punishes her with a greater violence than she even sought to inflict on Al in the first place. I guess this shouldn't matter. I guess I'm supposed to take her posthumous texts and the fantasy that the police would take so seriously the disappearance of a woman who was last seen, again, ostensibly doing sex work, as Cassie's ultimate victory. But Fennell has said that she wanted the movie to end with the men burning Cassie's body, and honestly, it might as well have just ended there. As I've already mentioned, it is deeply unlikely that Al would actually face real consequences for her murder. And then, as far as the assault goes, was Nina's assault even still within the statute of limitations? Would anything really actually have been done with that tape from college? It seems like Fennell knew that the answer was no. That's why what Al is arrested for is Cassie's murder instead. The word that really keeps coming up for me as I think about this movie is just betrayal. I think Fennell made a movie that betrayed its viewers, betrayed the survivors in her audience, and betrayed any kind of hope it might have had at making any sort of a real statement. This movie's subversions are not clever. It makes me think of the conventional wisdom in writing, not only that second and third drafts are useful and necessary, but also that you need to understand the rules that you are breaking before you break them. Because otherwise you end up with the Emerald Fennell special, subversion just for subversion's sake. A film so interested in outsmarting its audience that it treats them like idiots for wanting the thing it offered them in the first place. And when it's a genre like rape revenge, like horror to begin with, honestly, with such well understood conventions and rules, you begin to feel like you've just been given a brownie made by a baker who substituted tomatoes in for chocolate and is just daring you to say that it tastes like ketchup, so that she can fawn over what an excellent job she did at surprising you without any real concern about whether or not it tasted good or was worth your money or was what you wanted. And this movie... I mean, look, you already know in great detail what I think about this movie. We have been here for most of the length of the runtime of Promising Young Woman. I don't think this movie is worth the cost of admission. I don't think this movie is worth the breathless credit it got, or the way even some of the feminists who criticized it at the time softened that criticism. I think this was an appropriation of a movement Emerald Fennell could not be bothered to understand, and a bad entry in a genre she clearly doesn't respect. I think it's objectively lazy to write only a single draft. And honestly, I think it's intellectually lazy to rely on nothing other than your own confidence that you're the most special and clever woman to ever have had thoughts to try to put something together worth saying and think you have done so in your first pass at the story. The one draft thing just really gets me. It just really gets me. I think we all deserved better from this movie. And I think we deserve to voice when a movie is bad, even when we want women to succeed. And I think a lot of the people who were a little too kind to this movie were that kind specifically because of their desire to see women succeed. But what about now? What about when Promising Young Woman isn't just somebody's first movie and the only material we have available to base our opinions on? What about when it's obvious that Fennell is just going to continue selling us movies that she couldn't be bothered to actually make? How many times over do we have to pretend like this is all we get to expect from a woman? Because personally, I think she's already been given us more than enough chances to show us what sort of work she makes and what kind of failings we can expect from them. And I simply don't agree that it's misogynistic to be realistic about that. I think it's a matter of holding her to the same standards we should be holding men to, and I promise I would have every ounce as many issues with this movie if it were made by a man as I do when it's made by Fennell. You should too. I particularly think it's important to interrogate the things that we're being asked to hold up as feminist or for women. Because for me, I don't want girl dinner. I don't want pinkish pastel SpawnCon manicure lady slop. I want a real meal. I want something to dig my teeth into. I want these fake feminists to stop using sexy mouth imagery for a version of feminism that has no real teeth and no real empathy for victims. Oh gosh, I can't even remember where else I've seen this kind of imagery in years after this movie came out. Too bad I have so many other things I'd rather talk about now, or else I really could have made a meal out of that. This movie won Oscars. Kind of a lot of them, actually, including for Best Screenplay. Again, for a one-pass draft that sometimes gets characters' names wrong during important scenes. In her single draft, she mixed up Al and Joe's name. A normal thing to have happen on your first draft, but holy fuck, so goddamn embarrassing for the one you released for wide reading through Variety. And Wuthering Heights is a huge box office success, even if some feminists online are holding Fennell's feet to the fire about it. Emerald Fennell is not the kind of woman who will not be able to withstand people actually critically examining her work. It will not ruin her career. It is not taking opportunities from her or taking food out of her mouth. She is an enormously privileged, enormously wealthy white woman who made a rape revenge movie that refused to say the word rape, and then, more recently, created the circumstances in which, during rampant white supremacy and regression on civil rights, people are feeling a need to defend her whitewashing of a romantic lead in her Wuthering Heights adaptation. If we don't get to criticize that, we don't get to criticize anything. And I will never sign on to that kind of thought-terminating cliche. That has never been what my feminism has been about. I hope you enjoyed this video, even and especially if this is still a movie you think fondly of. Like I said in the intro, I'm really not trying to take anything away from anybody here. I am just trying to demand that the things that we uphold as representative of feminism actually bother to convey any of that, and that we don't give passes to the most privileged amongst us who want to use that as a shield against being actually critically examined for what they are saying and what they are doing. I'm pretty certain that given how many times I had to use the kind of language Fennell was so avoidant of in her script and her press, that this video is not going to be particularly pushed by the YouTube algorithm. So if you liked it, maybe like it, maybe subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know what you think in the comments for sure. And if you're really feeling it, if you really enjoyed this video, I worked very hard on it, maybe post it somewhere or share it with a friend. I really just wouldn't have felt right self-censoring this one, so it is what it is in terms of the whole YouTube algorithm game. There's only so much I can do and still talk about the things that I want to talk about. So thank you very, very much to my Patreon friends who help make it a little bit easier to swallow spending a couple of weeks on something that I do not think is going to do particularly well. Patreon got drafts of this video while I was working on it, and as I mentioned, really helped me refine some of my thoughts by being so generous with their feedback when they watched those early versions. If you want to get in on the ground floor in future discussions like this, especially when I come back for seconds on Saltburn, maybe consider joining the Patreon. I will be back again soon. Thank you for letting me rant. I love you. Bye.